Okay, so now that we are through all of sort of our catch up and talking about our summer, let's get into our actual content for today, which we want to revisit for some of you and for some of you introduce this topic of the sequence of engagement in our resilience empowerment program. This concept, which comes from Dr. Bruce Perry, is in year one. And so this might be a refresher for some of you. When we get to our breakout sessions today, we will have a PDF with some scenarios for our breakout, and included in that PDF is also some additional information, including the reference to the Dr. Bruce Perry has a YouTube channel that has, I think, about 15 lessons that he put together right at the beginning of pandemic and right at the beginning of lockdown in order for educators and parents to use to sort of help kids get through and understand a little bit more, maybe some of the behavior that comes from stress. And so some of this content is from there as well. So we'll give you a link to that YouTube channel. Like I said, it's got about 15 lessons. They're like 15-ish minutes long or so and have a lot of great information about not only a sequence of engagement, but regulation and emotional contagion and things like that. So sequence of engagement is really a way or a framework to talk about the way that information sequentially goes through the brain and how your brain organizes information. And we often talk about this in terms of using the vocabulary regulate, relate, and reason. And this upside down triangle is meant to represent the brain, where at the very bottom of the brain stem, is where information and words and nonverbal communication and sensory input are coming into the brain. It moves up into the limbic part of the brain, which is the emotional part of the brain, and more information gets attached to that sensory input. And then where we really want it to go is to our cortex, the upper part of the brain that contains logic and reasoning. This is the sequence or the order in which our brains process information, right? So when we're talking about this in an educational setting, obviously we want to reach someone's cortex, right? We're giving out information, giving information, teaching, and that information is coming from our cortex and we want it to plop into someone else's cortex. But what we need to recognize and keep in mind is that there is an order of operations for this, right? And that is what we are going to call the sequence of engagement. And it is also described as the process of regulate, relate, and reason. So let's talk about what that looks like maybe in a classroom. We're going to use math as an example. So in the sequence of engagement or the sequence of processing, right, we want to take this math concept in our cortex and we want to put it out into the classroom and we want everyone to scoop it up and get it into their cortex, right? So where it says math, 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 that's our cortex. It's got to go down through the emotional part of our brain in the middle there, down to the very bottom, which is the reactive part of our brain, and then out in a sensory way into the world, right? So we're going to be speaking words, but also a huge part of communication, a way bigger part of communication than our language, our actual words that we use, is our facial expression and our tone of voice. So 55% of the communication is coming from our facial expression, and 38% is our tone of voice, and then just a tiny little amount are the actual words that we use. So the way we look, the way we stand, and how we say what we say counts for way more than anything else. So you can see in the middle there, it's got that arrow going across to the other person's brain. And in an ideal world, right, this information is going to go into the bottom part of their brain, move through the emotional part of their brain, and then get up into their cortex and get moved into executive function, logic and reasoning, stored in our memory, right? So that's our ideal situation. But what happens when the ideal situation doesn't take place? Sort of how can we think about that and where can that information go sideways and maybe not end up in the cortex, okay? So we're going to sit here and look at this for a little bit. So same example, we've got a really excited math teacher who has this great new math concept and knows exactly how they want to convey it to the classroom, right? And so in the cortex of the teacher's brain, we've got math, 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 and it goes down into the emotional part of the brain. But this teacher is super excited about it. So it comes out of the emotional part of the brain looking all good still with some excitement and energy behind it. It goes into the very bottom of the brain, which is the reactive part of the brain, and it comes out with facial expression and tone of voice that are pretty excited, except for, let's say, there's one student who we know struggles with math, and they're in the back of the room and maybe not exactly looking at us, or we don't feel like they're paying attention. And so we're kind of laser focused with our eyesight on this student, and maybe our eyes are squinted a little bit so we can make sure we see, is this student paying attention? All good attention intentions on the math teacher side, right? It's coming out with excitement and energy, but the facial expression is a little intense, a little bit like, hey, are you listening? Can you hear me? I know you're struggling with this and I want to make sure it gets into your brain. That goes into the reactive part first of this student's brain, right? And all of this is happening so fast, right? This isn't like a slow motion thing where we're consciously aware of the emotion and reactions and expressions that our brain is attaching to our words, right? Same for the student. This is all happening in split seconds in their brain. So let's say this really intense look coupled with some excitement about math goes into the reactive part of the student's brain. And as it travels up to the emotional part, the student isn't really hearing the math, they're just seeing the look on your face. And they're remembering that they don't think you know, they think that you don't think they know how to do math. And it really starts to go sideways in their brain. My teacher doesn't think I'm smart. My teacher doesn't think I'm doing this. Look at her staring at me. Look at the way she's glaring at me. She doesn't think I'm paying attention, right? And like I said, this is all going so quickly through their brain. This is not a conscious process. This is a very subconscious and unconscious process. And the cortex takes this information and says, this teacher doesn't like me. I don't like math. I'm not safe here. And that does not accomplish what we want, right? That information does not stay in the cortex and get put into the logical thinking and memory part of our brain. We are stuck sort of in this emotional and reactive part of just, my teacher doesn't like me. I'm not good at math. Look at her staring at me, right? So these two individuals in this example are in the same situation with the same words, right? But having extremely different experiences. And they're kind of like a self-fulfilling thing, right? Because then the student is going to tune out more and feel more disengaged because they're in this emotional state, which is obviously going to cause the teacher to think, oh my God, they're really not listening. Like I've told them a million times, they need to take notes. I want to help them. I want them to get through this problem, right? So it's kind of like this cycle that's picking up. So when we think about it in those terms, and in, I think, a really salient example of what very often can happen when we are not considering the order of events here, because for this teacher, if they can take a beat and zoom out a little bit and think, okay, maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe this doesn't have to do with whether or not they enjoy math. If we can remember how the brain processes information and that this is going through the reactive part of the brain and the emotional part of the brain first, those parts of the brain get first dibs on the info. It would be great if our cortex could get first dibs on info, right? I think we would bypass a lot of these interpersonal issues and behavior issues that we see if our cortex lined up first. But the reason it can't is because the cortex is not fully formed. It's not fully formed until, right, we're in our mid 20s. So the emotional and the reactive parts of the brain, they get the first call on how this information gets processed. And I sometimes I feel like just knowing that can almost be a relief, Like when you see a reaction to information or you see someone sort of shutting down to something, it's a safer bet to think emotionally something's happening versus a bet saying they don't understand or don't like me, or right. So if we think about the facial expression and tone of voice and the emotional part of the brain kind of all coming together with the info first, the most logical assumption is something's been hijacked in the emotional center of the emotional part of this person's brain, and that's why this conversation is going sideways. And if we can look at it that way, the next most logical thing to do is think about, how can we get to that regulation state? How can we take a step back, reverse out of the emotion part of our brain, take some breaths, take a walk, connect, have some sort of connection, like, hey, I can see you're really struggling with this. What can we do? How can we approach this differently? And then get into the reasoning part. Now, I'm going to give an example that I know is a little bit difficult when we're talking about, or very different than if we're talking about being in a classroom. But, if we're talking math, and getting hijacked by emotion, this is a perfect example for me and my daughter doing her math homework together, right? Because not only when the math goes through the emotional part of my brain, does it come out with a little bit of like, ugh, I don't know what I'm doing. It starts to get into the emotional part of her brain of, ugh, I don't know what I'm doing. And if we're not really careful, we can really start to become really reactive to each other, right? Because I'm trying to help her get through it and she's trying to get out of getting through it. And on a good day, I can say, you know what, we're obviously having a really hard time with this math problem. Let's go walk the dog for a second. Let's come back. Let's look up a video to see how we can get through this problem together because I don't know what I'm doing, right? But, and I know that that's not always something that we can do in a classroom, but it's a framework of a way of thinking about how can we move away from these parts of the brain that are very reactive and emotional and don't have the executive function and logic and reasoning. How can we get to our cortex? How can we make this conversation work in a way where we are moving towards your cortex? So the sequence of engagement is a framework for viewing a reaction or for viewing an interaction, and how, and when our goal is getting to the cortex. If we know we have information that we need to get into our students' cortexes so that they have it for their future, so that they can perform well and move on to the next thing and feel confident in their abilities, we know that that the students have to be regulated, as do we, and that we have to have a connection and have some kind of felt safety there in the classroom. So this also goes back to our trauma-informed pillars that we talk about pretty much in every training in our resilience empowerment program. The first step to moving towards that sequence of engagement, high level of being able to reason, is to have the felt safety. Being able to create felt safety in our environment and in our classrooms, in our schools, and in our community is essential to having more access to the cortex and more access to the ability to create this second step, which are close connections and relationships. Having a connection and a relationship in an environment with really good felt safety allows students to be able to move to coping mechanisms and allows us to be able to model good coping mechanisms and teach new coping mechanisms, right? When a student feels safe and has a relationship with a teacher, we can have conversations about, hey, I really see you having a hard time with math, and I see you not being able to focus on taking notes and doing stuff. What's going on there for you? How can I help you? What way, how can we move past this, right? And being able to engage in that back and forth conversation. But that doesn't happen very easily if we don't have the felt safety and the connection. So I would really encourage you to dive into this a little bit deeper by, if this is something that really lands for you or piques your interest. The YouTube channel this came from, the Neurosequential Network, will be on the worksheet that we use for our breakout rooms in just a moment. And for those of you that are watching this in recording, we will be sure to attach that PDF. One thing that we are also going to have in the PDF with the resources for the YouTube channel for Bruce Perry, we also have a worksheet for you to be able to do later on your own that really goes to thinking about the facial expression and the tone of voice part of communication, and some of the more nonverbal parts of communication. This summer, we started working through a book by Dr. Lori DeSaltis, Body and Brain Brilliance. That information is also on the PDF that we'll drop in the chat or attach to the recording of this. And in that book, which we highly recommend to all of you, again, it's Body and Brain Brilliance by Dr. Lori DeSaltis. She's got a whole bunch of focused areas of practice and just thoughtful exercises for both you and for both teachers and students. And so one of the exercises that we've added to our PDF for this and our PDF guide for this are questions for personal reflection, really thinking about your body's nerve and your nervous system's nonverbal story. So there's some great questions in there too. Things like, can you think of a time when you read the body language of someone who was comfortable, and what did that look like? And then, questions like, when you are angry, what do your eyes look like? What does your tone of voice sound like? And really starting to think of some of these different ways of communication. So we have added that reflective exercise into there for all of you to kind of think about as you head back to school this year. When we believe that an individual has complete control over his or her behavior, we are more likely to be angry when that behavior is inappropriate. So I really want to think here about what do we consider good behavior in a classroom, and sort of what are our assumptions about good behavior, and what are our assumptions and blind spots about bad behavior, right? When the emotional brain gets first dibs on interpreting incoming information, and the repeated activation of a stress response system causes long-term damage, those pathways for automatic behavior are really ingrained, right? So if we think about this, that we have assumptions and blind spots about both good behavior and bad behavior, and thinking about that the emotional brain gets first dibs on interpreting incoming information, if we believe that the student has complete control over their behavior, we are more likely to be angry about that behavior. But if we can step back from that belief and look at this example, if we can step back from that belief that they're in complete control of their behavior, right? So complete is an important part of that. And we think about this and what the emotional and reactive part of the brains has done to this information, and this student is in a subconscious way starting to really not be able to focus and stay present. I think we can step away from inappropriate behavior making us angry. And that's a big part of the equation, is for us to stay in tune with our regulation. And as we go through these trainings every year in schools, what we talk about is all of this information is part of a toolkit that allows us to zoom out and take a broader look at what else might be going on when we see behavior that we don't like or that is truly disruptive, right? And this isn't an excuse for disruptive behavior at all. It's a framework to view the behavior when the goal is to replace maladaptive with adaptive behavior through felt safety, connection, and coping. So we are going to break out into some small group discussions. I'm going to drop a PDF in the chat that has got some behavior scenarios for you. Feel free to pick one of the behavior scenarios in the PDF. Please download it before you go into your breakout room. Pick one of the scenarios on there, or in your group, if you have one, a recent example or something that really stands out for you. Feel free to share that with the group and use your own. And what I'm going to have you do is discuss the difference between viewing behavior from the bottom up, which means thinking about the sequence of engagement as emotions and reactions, getting dibs on the info first, and how we can shift the way we deal with behavior and consequences from that viewpoint. And then thinking about what does that look like when we're not remembering the sequence of engagement and looking at behavior from a top-down perspective, which would be, I have this information in my cortex and I'm going to keep giving it to you until I see you get it, right? Without focusing on the relational and regulation pieces of this. So just a quick note for those of you that are watching this on the recording, we will not be coming back to recording after the breakout rooms. For those of you going into the breakout session, we'll give you about 20 minutes to do that. We'll come back here and do a brief share and then do some question and answer before we finish out. So go ahead and look for your breakout room to pop up and make sure that you have downloaded the behavior situations and enjoy your conversations.